thank y'all for having me this evening. One of the questions that I often get is, how did I become the person I am in terms of local history? How did I become a historian? How did I come to work for the public library? And so, what Brandon asked me to do is to sort of talk about that and you know, and then talk a little bit about what we have at the library that may be of interest for you. First, I was born in 1964. And when I was 5 years old, the city celebrated its 150th anniversary, the sesquicentennial is what it was called. Kind of hard to say, but it was a big deal. It was coming a year after Dr. King's murder and the sanitation strike, so the city really needed something to feel good about itself. And so looking back in its past was a way to do that. There were all of these kind of celebrations going on in the city, much bigger, I think, than what we experienced a few years ago with our bicentennial in 2019, although that had some very interesting things as well. But in 1969, not only were there things like at the fair and the Cotton Carnival and all of that, but for me, one of the coolest things was the Commercial Appeal and the Press Center both published this 150-page book that came with the Sunday paper in May of '69. And my parents kept that on the bookshelf with the Funk and Wagnall encyclopedias that we had. And it was something that I pored over often. I mean, in '69, I was 5, I could barely read a little bit. But looking at the images, and as I got older, reading about my hometown, about streets and intersections that I was familiar with, it brought history alive to me in a way that other things perhaps did not. I was probably a little bit weird in that I was as interested in what happened 150 years ago as I was what was happening then. And as I got older, knowing a lot of, excuse me, I have just a personal point. I suffer from what is called Meniere's disease, which makes you a little bit. No, ma'am, I'm fine. I'm fine. But I've had an episode today, and it's making me a little wobbly, but I'm fine. So reading that book and rereading that book, as I said, brought history to life and made me interested in the history of this community. And that was reinforced by the stories of my parents, telling me about the wrestler Sputnik Monroe, or my grandparents talking about life during the Great Depression and during World War II. And also keep in mind that in the 1970s on television, and you know, television was, you had 3 channels, right? And whatever was on TV was TV. It wasn't as though you thought about, oh, that's the old channel or that's the new channel or whatever. If it was on TV and you'd never seen it, it was new to you. Well, you know, Channel 3 showed a lot of old movies from the 30s and the 40s. So listening to what my parents were saying, seeing what I was seeing in the sesquicentennial book, and what my grandparents were telling me, and then seeing these old films and old short subjects that Channel 3 used to show, all of that made that era of the first half of the 20th century sort of come alive for me. And going to college and then going to graduate school, when I got out of graduate school, I'd had the opportunity to investigate the papers of William Fulbright, who was a senator from the state of Arkansas, was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And looking through his papers, I realized, you know, how history, again, comes alive when you look at the primary sources that were created at the time. So there are letters in there from people, for example, I was investigating the early Lyndon Johnson era and looking at how were people reacting to the change in government from JFK to LBJ. And there were all these letters from people who were just pouring their hearts out about how they thought the country had somehow gone off track, that the murder of the president was a symptom of something larger. And so you saw how people were feeling, not just what they were doing, but what they thought. And so the learning about how people thought about things and that those ideas were encased within these collections had a profound effect upon me, as did when a few years earlier, when I took Dr. Charles Crawford, a history class by Dr. Charles Crawford. And in that class, he played for us an interview of a former slave from the 1930s who described what life was like. And not only did Dr. Crawford play that tape, he also analyzed it for us after the tape was finished. And he said, okay, now see, he said bluecoats. Well, those are the Union forces that came into his area. And he looked at, told us other things. And so I heard this man's voice, who had lived during the 1860s and had been alive through the Great Depression. And so to me, I learned that history was not the story so much of great men as it was of great people who built this country, people who built this city and this county. So I wanted to explore that. And I had the opportunity to come to work for the public library, and after a couple of years working in the Link department, I was able to move over to the history department. And in the history department, I discovered a treasure trove of those kinds of stories that I was talking about, those kinds of letters, diaries, photographs that tell the story of history in a very immediate way. And I think I will sit down if y'all don't mind. So, came to work for the library. I had a master's degree in history and had a hunger for primary sources. I wanted to read and know these sorts of things. And so being in the history department, we were all given projects to work on. And the first project I was given was to preserve and make accessible the collection of a Memphis mayor, a man named Frank Toby. Toby was mayor in the early mid-1950s, only for a few years, but he was the last Memphis mayor selected by E.H. Crump, the political boss who dominated Memphis in the first half of the 20th century. So I was able to go through his papers, and it's like reading somebody else's mail, but in a good way. I'm not looking for salacious information, I'm just trying to figure out how things work. And in his papers, there were these primary sources related to a bombing that had taken place in 1953 in South Memphis on a street called East Olive, not far from Trigg in Florida, in that section of South Memphis. And what people don't always think of when they think of South Memphis, they think of South Memphis as being a white neighborhood that became a black neighborhood. But it really wasn't that way for a long period of time. From the 1930s until the early 1970s, it was a white and black neighborhood. There were sections of South Memphis that were streets that were majority African American, even in the 1930s and 1940s. There were examples of that. Schools were segregated, so the two communities didn't necessarily interact very much, but they were there. They were very close to each other. But in the 1950s and 1953, a family moved on to East Olive Street, an African-American family. They were actually the 8th family to move on the street, but apparently 8 was one too many, and somebody set off a pipe bomb on their porch. No one, fortunately, was hurt. But what I found interesting about what happened is, this is the beginnings of the civil rights movement. The Brown decision hasn't yet been handed down by the Supreme Court. But the city, Mayor Toby sends the police into East Olive. They have round-the-clock patrols. And they say, we're not gonna have this. And we're gonna stop this now. And so they worked with both communities to tamp down racial tension in the community, and eventually things settled down. The family stayed, although they talked about moving away, but they stayed. Things were calm and no more problems. And so I was fascinated by the way the city handled this situation, that the expectation would be, as somebody from the outside who didn't grow up, okay, who was born a decade later, would be that the city would take the side of the white community, and particularly those who use the bomb. But that's not the case. The city was very clear, we're not gonna have this, period. We're not gonna have any violence. And that actually would go on, I would discover later, would be the basic view of the civil rights movement in Memphis until 1968. Because when the schools were desegregated in 1961, the police commissioner, Claude Armour, said, stay away from these schools. Anybody, white, black, who comes close to these schools, they created a cordon around each school. He said, if you come in, you're gonna get arrested, and we're not gonna have any violence here. And so I learned something very profound about the city by investigating these primary sources. I knew nothing of this story until I found those letters. And so from that point, I started to collect these stories for myself, thinking that, I'm learning all this stuff. But what good is it if I'm not sharing it with other people? And so I started writing articles for the West Tennessee Historical Society papers, which is a journal that's published once a year by the Historical Society. And and from there, started writing books. And so my first book was about E.H. Crump, the book that was mentioned, Mayor Crump Don't Like It. It was basically a history of the political machine that E.H. Crump controlled, because I was fascinated by the fact of how many things they got done. I was less interested in sort of some of the extra legal means that they would sometimes use to stay in power. There was at least one election stolen, it's pretty clear, that sort of thing. But what I was really interested in is how this worked, because what I would hear from my grandparents was that if you had a problem in Shelby County, you could go to Mr. Crump and it would be solved. Now that is not the experience I was familiar with in dealing with city government. And so how did that happen? How was that organized? How did people accept it? Because from the outside, a lot of people said, well, this was a dictatorship, that the people simply handed over power to Mr. Crump and he did whatever he wanted, and then if they had a problem, he'd solve it. Well, I found that the opposite was actually true, that the people were very involved in political affairs during the teens, 20s, through the 1950s. Every neighborhood had a civic club. They worked very closely with both the political organization and city government. And the people were constantly demanding action and change in the city. And Mr. Crump, wanting to stay in power, listened to those concerns, and in most cases did something about it, which again is not always the feeling you have when you deal with local government in the 21st century. And another thing that I found out that I think is extremely important is that African Americans voted in very large numbers in Memphis. And because they demanded the right to vote, and they used it to gain improvements for their community. Memphis had one of the best school systems for African Americans, still unequal, mind you, but far less unequal in terms of facilities, in terms of books, in terms of the curriculum than in other southern cities. Most of the black communities in the city had good street lights, the streets were paved, they weren't as ignored as people would assume that they were, because they said, hey, you want my vote? I want this area taken care of. And you had all these black leaders who worked with the Crump organization to improve things. And really, this lays the foundation for the end of segregation, because African Americans in Memphis are so used to voting, using their political power as leverage to gain concessions from the white community, that when the civil rights movement takes hold, then it becomes, I wouldn't say easier, but there is a mechanism, there are steps you can take. If you're in a small town, you don't know what to do. You can protest and that sort of thing, but how do you concretely get things changed? Well, in Memphis, there's a process for doing that. You go to the power structure and you say, we want this, and they say no, and you say, well, we're going to vote against you. Well, maybe we will do this, and then they start working. And a good example of this is in 1960-61 during the sit-in demonstrations in Memphis, started by young people who were college students. They didn't know, like all college students, they don't know as much as they think they do, and certainly true in my case. And so they start these demonstrations, but older political leaders come in, sit down with the city, and also sit down with the local business owners, and they hammer out an agreement where not only will the lunch counters and the department store restaurants be desegregated, but they also agreed to hire black clerks to work in the stores, to wait on customers. That wasn't happening in other places because blacks did not have the political influence they did in other places. And all of this I found just by searching through the documents. And so that leads to the first book. The second book is called Crusades for Freedom, and it's about this period that we were just talking about, the civil rights movement, and also the growth of the Republican Party in Shelby County. From the end of the Civil War on, Memphis was a Democratic town. Everybody voted Democratic. If you voted Republican, you were a very strange creature and you weren't going to have any political influence. But in the 1950s and the 1960s, Republicans began to gain ground, become a lot of white voters move over to the Republican Party, black voters who had supported the Republican Party move over to the Democratic Party, and you have basically the alignment that we sort of have now, although things are kind of in flux right now. I'm not sure where we're going to go with our two-party system, but from there, once I'd written those two books, which were published by the University Press of Mississippi, sort of academic books, I wanted to make sure, although my writing style is the same, basically, but I wanted to reach as many people as possible. I don't want just scholars sitting around reading this stuff. I want to reach as many people who are interested in history as I can. So I started writing these smaller books for a company called Arcadia Publishing, which has an imprint called the History Press. And so the first book I wrote for them was called Hidden History of Memphis, and it was a collection of stories that I had found out about, learned about, that didn't fit in a larger book. So these are sort of short essays about different aspects of Memphis. I talked about when television first came to Memphis, early radio stations, and then also things like there was a Memphis gangster named Popeye Pumphrey who influenced William Faulkner to write his novel Sanctuary. In fact, there's a character in Sanctuary called Popeye, named for this Memphis gangster. So those are the kinds of stories that I wrote about in hidden history. Some of the other books that I've written about, I wrote a book about slavery in Memphis, because what I discovered is that slavery in an urban center is far different than slavery in a rural area. And trying to look at the lives of some of the slaves themselves. One of them that I wrote about is a man named Thomas Bland, who was owned by a man named McGee, who was a cotton planter from Pontotoc, Mississippi, who moved to the big city, built a big mansion, and lived here while overseers and managers took care of his farm. And one day, Thomas was McGee's wagon driver, his drayman. Not only did he drive the family to town and back, he also, any goods that were shipped, he would go to town and pick them up and go to the dry goods store and pick up whatever they ordered. And one day he noticed there were some plasterers who were working on doing some repairs on the home, who were black, who he assumed were slaves, and they were. But they were slaves who hired out their time. They were owned by someone who allowed them to do their own work on their own time, live away from the owner, and he simply shared most of the income with his owner. It was a very inexpensive way to own slaves, because you don't have to pay for his upkeep. He's required to do that using the money that he gets, and but you still collect a weekly income from him because you own him. And so Thomas noticed that he's writing things down. You know, he's doing calculations and figuring out how to do the plastering right. And so Thomas goes up to him secretly and says, "Can you teach me how to do that, how to read and write?" And he says, "Okay, come to my place." Tells him where it is tonight, and we'll sit down. And so he learns to read and write. And once he feels comfortable with reading and writing, he writes out a pass, a work permit, that says that he's allowed to go into town, find a job, stay on that job as long as he will be, as long as he's needed, and he has my permission to do so. So he forges his owner's signature, and he goes into Memphis, and Memphis is a huge riverboat town. A lot of riverboats traveling up and down the Mississippi, and almost all of them need workers. And so he goes to a riverboat owner, a pilot, goes up to the pilot house, presents him with his pass, and he says, "Well, you know, I need somebody, I'll hire you right now." And so 24 hours later, he's in Ohio, in a free state, and he eventually, within a month or so, makes his way all the way to Canada. And when he's in Canada, he takes his writing skills and composes a letter to his owner and says, "I'm in Canada, you can't get me." And, the owner, Mr. McGee, was furious. But, Thomas, like many, was able to flee his circumstances and actually flourish after the war and after emancipation came. So those are just some of the stories that I've learned about our community. And they are all there at the library, not only in my books, but in the primary sources there. And although I've not done a lot of work about the communities outside of Memphis, but we've got a lot on Bartlett in particular. We have some manuscript collections of some families who own property out here, and we have a large clipping file on Bartlett, and there are those who have written histories about parts of Bartlett that we also have copies of as well. So Bartlett, of course, being a very important community within our county, and have contributed a lot to the development of this county for over 200 years. So that is what the Memphis Room is, and this is how you become a public historian in Memphis. Any questions?
You have Jonathan K.T. Smith's archives?
We did.
Okay.
We did. In fact, yeah, he was a good friend of ours. We have everything that he ever put together because he always gave us a copy.
Mm-hmm. So
yes, we do. We sure do. And I would say that he is the leading Bartlett historian and genealogist. I don't think there's any doubt about that. That's where, if I was researching Bartlett, his material would be the first place I'd go. Yeah. Well, listen, thank y'all very much.